Welcome to the Let's Talk About podcast, where we help you to have life's most difficult and challenging conversations. We talk about the things that most people avoid, the subjects that affect us on a day-to-day basis, but for some reason we find them difficult and challenging to talk about. We'll give you tips and strategies on how to have those conversations and support networks at the end of each podcast if you need them. One of the biggest lessons I learnt as a hostage and crisis negotiator were that we all have a story. And in each one of our stories, there are lessons for us all to learn. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Let's Talk About series of conversations. And today, I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Tom Emery. And Tom is going to talk to us about his story, how he came to be where he is now, the conversations that helped him, and some tools that you will be able to take away. So Tom, very welcome. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your time. And just tell the listeners a little bit about you.
Thank you, Nicky. Yeah, so where do I start? So I grew up in just on the outskirts of Greater Manchester, and I suppose I had a pretty normal childhood. The only sort of slight thing that's important to my story about when I was a child was that I was a queer kid, and that meant I grew up with a certain perspective on the world. And I grew up in the 1990s, and the world wasn't always a particularly friendly place for me, which very much shaped how I think I, related to the world, perceived the world. As someone who's very highly extroverted, I often found I had to hide in the shadows, and that was quite difficult for me. And so a big part of my work now is helping people to really be themselves, because I think that's where you find all the joy and all the success that you have in your life. So, yes, I had other than that, pretty normal childhood. Fell into working in human resources when I was at university, was working in Sainsbury's, stacking the shelves, hated it. There were two offices on the corridor behind the staff area. One was the administration office, the other was the personnel office. I knocked on the personnel office, knocked on the admin office. The personnel manager gave me a job. And so that was how I became an HR leader, and did a sort of personnel manager in training role with Sainsbury's. Then did lots of different HR jobs and ended up in financial services for the last 15 years. I worked for HSBC, did lots of different jobs there, and then I was chief people officer at a wealth management firm in the city called Brooks Macdonald. And I suppose that's really where I honed the craft of helping people, coaching people, helping them with their relationships, helping them to have better relationships with each other, more impactful and more effective relationships. And then in 2022, I decided to leave, and I set up my own business, which is called HEX. And we really do what I've talked about, going back to my childhood. We help people to find joy in what they do, confidence in who they are, fulfillment in what they achieve. We work with exec teams, we work with leaders, we coach, we mentor, we consult. And yeah, if we think we can do it and we think we're going to enjoy it, then we'll have a go at it. And that's our ethos. And we do, I hope we do some really great work with some great people.
Thank you, Tom, for the whistle-stop tour of your life. That was great. There's a couple of words that really stood out for me, sentences in that. Was one, hiding in the shadows, and being yourself. Because I can imagine that life was pretty tough growing up.
I think it could be. I'm always sort of quite conscious that I don't want it to sound like a sob story, because I didn't have a bad childhood. I had lots of opportunities. I had a very loving family and all that sort of stuff. I think the important thing for me was that if you think about how you're made up as a person, and I look at people, and you have your genetics, which, you can't really do anything about. And then you have your adaptations, which you get from your childhood and from your relationships. And then you have your behaviours. And I think what my adult life has been, like it is for a lot of people, and a lot of the people I work with, it's been really working out what my adaptations are, and working out where they're not really helping me, and therefore where I need to try and intentionally change my behavior. So, so I think one of my adaptations is that when I'm stressed, I'll go very quiet. I'll sort of try and melt into the background and be invisible. And sometimes that's not the best place to be. Like sometimes, you need to really lean into the discomfort of doing something different. And so, yeah, I think there were some really important lessons. I think we're all fighting our adaptations as we go through life. And then the other thing about being yourself. I mean, yeah, I mean that I suppose the day that I came out, well, you come out all the time as a queer person, but
Mm.
I think the day that I really sort of came out was a real life-changing day for me, and that was a real change for the better. And I think that's inspired me to make sure that I do everything to help people have that confidence in who they are, because if you're not being yourself and you're hiding, it's uncomfortable, it's tiring, and it means that you can't bring all your strengths and all your amazing qualities to a situation. So it gives me, I think, hopefully a bit of a wholesome higher purpose for the work that I do and how I essentially, obviously, make a living and pay the bills.
Mm. Adaptations is a great word. I love that.
Yeah,
And you reminded me there of that, like, fight, flight, or freeze, when we're feeling uncomfortable, that we'll go into
yeah,
that fight, flight, and freeze. And around communication, that's often avoiding a subject or a difficult conversation, whatever
yeah.
that might be for you individually. And I always
Mm,
say that those conversations that you're avoiding are probably the ones you really should be having. And they
absolutely.
often come with consequence. And sometimes that consequence can be based in fear around
Mm,
other people's perceptions of who you are. So yeah, thank
yeah.
you for sharing that. Yeah,
Mm,
and being
yeah.
yourself. So how do you, and you've used three of my favorite words there: joy, confidence, and fulfillment.
Yeah.
How do you bring that into the world of senior leadership? And then we'll look at
Oh,
how we
crikey.
can transform that over
Mm.
those people who are listening.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I encourage people not to take things too seriously. I think that our egos are very powerful, and often, our egos as people who get very senior into organizations, their egos really help them to get there, because often your ego is really what is driving you, and, creates a sense of like competition with others, or just drives you to be better. But often ego, tips into something else, and it causes you to get very overly invested in, right or wrong, or, whether someone's values meet yours, or, whether somebody's being critical or judgmental of you. And so the first thing that I always do is, like, if you want to find joy, then you need to take yourself a little bit less seriously, and, intentionally try and enjoy some of the situations and give other people a break and not be too judgmental around them. I mean, I think the other thing is that, and this probably links with very much with your expertise and maybe your experience, is that I think organizations live or die on their ability to have honest and open conversations with each other in a way that doesn't damage psychological safety.
Mm.
So, when we talk about psychological safety, which is a bit of a buzzword, but an important concept, where, we want people to be able to challenge each other effectively. We want people to be able to call stuff out and bring their creativity and their ideas. Then I think we have to find better ways of having those conversations with each other. And, what some of the frameworks that I use are very much focused around, well, how do you have a conversation? How do I give you some feedback, Nicky,
Mm.
in a way that means that you're going to take that feedback and you can make your own decision about what you do with that feedback, but you're not feeling judged or feeling criticized or blamed for something. And so I always, a lot of the work that I do to help people to find joy is to, not remove discomfort from situations and from leadership, because leadership is inherently often uncomfortable, but to give people strategies for making it easier, because I don't think it is difficult. I think it's easy, but it takes intention and it takes focus and commitment.
I love that focus, intention, and commitment because I always say
Mm,
most of the time the conversations that we're having are pretty unconscious, and they're just going through the run of the mill. Hey, how are
mm,
you today? And we can stay there. We can stay at that nice tip of the iceberg, safe conversation, but we don't really get to the heart of what's going on, especially if there
yeah.
might be something going on.
But yeah, I mean, to build on that, I think we go through life pretty mindlessly, to be honest. I know I find staying present extremely difficult. I'm constantly somewhere else, on to the next thing, or worrying about the last thing, or whatever it is. And I think that is it's quite a mindless way of being, and we sort of accept that that's the way it has to be, I think. And when it doesn't, like we can make ourselves present, and we can think about the conversation we're in, and we can listen to what people are saying. Listen to hear them, not just to nod and respond. Yeah, so I think intentionality, whilst it's tiring, is so valuable in leadership, in life, to be honest.
Mm. Yeah, I tend to agree with you there, Tom. I think it is tiring being
Mm,
intentional and being present. I also think it's a skill that people can practice
mm,
and get much
yeah.
better at around how they show up and the intention of their conversations. I'll be
Mm,
interested to listen to some of your tools if you're happy to share some of them today.
mm,
But just before we go into that, I wanted to talk about one of my favorite words, ego.
yeah.
As a hostage and crisis negotiator, I was always taught to leave your ego at the door and don't let
Mm,
it become all about you. And I think some of the
mm.
things that you're saying around leadership and sometimes I do think it's just like you don't have to be right. And
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, I think we over-index on right and wrong. I mean, I go into countless organizations that have one of their, stated values or guiding principles or whatever is, we do the right thing. And I think, crikey, how on earth can anyone work out like what's the right thing? Like my right and your right, might be very different. And that's often what causes the problems, I think, because we feel like we're right and therefore we have a right. Sorry, it's too many rights here. We're right and we have the, obligation to make everybody else agree with that.
mm,
And, right and wrong is, in many situations, it's fairly arbitrary, I think. And yeah, so I think the right and wrong thing is, yeah, can be quite damaging actually to organizations, if I'm honest.
yeah, and to
Mm.
human beings, I think in general, because
Mm.
why would we make somebody wrong intentionally?
Mm.
Because what do we gain from that?
Yeah, exactly. It's a strange thing, right and wrong. And yeah, we can just get so fixated on it. And if somebody tells you that you're wrong,
Mm,
you know, that does it's going to press a lot of buttons for
yeah.
people. It'll link to potentially. I mean, like talking about adaptations again. Like there was, like I said, I grew up in a very loving home, but it was a home where right and wrong was something that was very, being right was really valued.
Mm,
And so, yeah, that adaptation, I can see that in family members where, if they're right, they've got to make sure everyone else agrees, and you can't stop until everyone else agrees that it's right. And I don't, I think it's a waste of time, to be honest.
mm.
Going back to the joy thing, it's like, crikey, just let people be, let them think what they think.
Yeah, it does take away the joy.
Mm.
Although I do have to confess, Tom, I do like to be right, and I
So,
will go and find evidence that
so
makes
do
me
I.
right. Yes, and I'll phone
Yeah.
if I really want to be right. I'll phone one of my really good friends who I know will always agree with me and say, "I'm right about
Mm.
this, aren't I?" And they'll go, "Oh, yes, Nick,
Yeah.
you're right about this." I think it's a validation thing. How we like to
Mm.
feel part of a group. So
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
ourselves, but some people know us more than other people. Some people know
Yeah.
us the deep dark side of all of it.
Mm.
So yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. And to be honest, that's another thing that we work with teams. So, and it's linked to creating joy is creating trust. Because if you have trust in your teams, then you can create joy, you can create belonging so much more easily. And actually you can have disagreements about who's right or wrong and still walk away, friends, and because the trust is there, and that's trust is the bedrock of any great team.
Yeah, I think trust is the bedrock of most relationships, and being able to influence other people so that they'll listen to your opinion. I always say that trust is the hardest thing in the world to get and the easiest thing in the world to lose.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
So tell us about your framework, Tom, and how this works out. Because you said that difficult conversations are actually not difficult. They're very easy. And I think a lot of people are scared of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mistake that we make with difficult conversations is that we want to control the outcome of it, and we're too fixated on the outcome. And actually, conversations are unique, organic things that we can never actually control an outcome. No, all we can do is control the inputs that we put into it. So, I mean, I use a framework called OI3C, which stands for observation, impact, and then there are three C's, which are curious, change, and continue. And this framework I've used all over the place for things like giving feedback, for asking for help, for expressing a need, or for providing recognition. And it focuses very much on what I would call business feedback. So it doesn't focus on feedback around personality. It tries to remove judgment. So the first stage of it is just to talk about what you observe. And in business, often what we observe, we want to align to a person. So we want to say, I saw you doing that. And I always try and get people to flip that on its head. So talk about the business, talk about what's happening, not about what a person is doing. So if you think about how that might work, something very simple like you've got someone who's very overpowering in a meeting, for example, people's instinct will be to say, well, I've got to say what I observe. And that is, you talk over people in meetings. Now, the problem with that is that may well go right to the core of the person who might have a value that they don't want to be the person that talks over people all the time. That might be quite hurtful to them. So the moment you give that feedback in that way, you've lost them. So the way I would approach that using the OI3C framework is to observe what's happening to other people when they're overpowering them. So I would say it felt like it was hard for people to get a word in during that meeting. I'm not sure everyone was able, therefore, impact I'm going on to now, to express themselves. And then I moved to curiosity, which is, what do you think? So at no point am I saying this is anything to do with you. I'm just making an observation around what's going on in the business. And I'm saying that, there might be an impact for it. And then I suppose the hope is that person says, oh, yeah, I noticed that as well. I wonder if I was the cause of that. Now, that might not happen, right, the first time. And it might be that is a conversation that has to happen 10, 15, 20 times before that person realizes that, oh, yeah, actually, I think maybe the way I turn up that meeting might be having an impact. But that's them finding their own outcome. It's finding their own impact. So I always encourage people to think about when you're giving feedback, when you're trying to influence, when you're, trying to get people to behave in a different way, just focus on giving them data to do to make their own decision rather than telling them what to do. So observation, impact, curious. And when we're curious, we always ask really open questions like, what do you think? How do you think that went? Not why did you do that or anything that's got that sort of judgment within it. And then only then, when we've done the curious thing, can we move to the change, because what you've generally done by asking people curious questions about what's going on is you end up building trust naturally. And at that point, then maybe that's when you can offer a change and you can say, like, oh, maybe you could just leave, just like sit back and let other people talk, for example. And then the continue one tends to be something that comes later. So, you might see a change and then you might say like, oh, I've noticed that you've been sitting back and I've seen that, the conversation seems to be like really thriving. So I think I think that's something that you should continue. So yeah, so that's basically the framework in a nutshell. Now, if you think about how else you can use that, you can use that to recognize people. So you can say, like, I've seen you do something really brilliant, and that's the impact, and that's great. I'd like you to continue with that. Sometimes people find it very, very difficult to ask for help
Mm.
because they feel that it might end up, they feel judged, or that the people are going to think they're incompetent. So I would say, like, if you're somebody who's got too much on, go to your manager and just say, gosh, I feel like I've got a lot on actually, and I'm struggling what to prioritize. What do you think? And see what comes back, rather than going to them with a problem to say, you're giving me too much work, I don't know what to do, which then that creates judgment on them. So I think it's a universal framework that can help in all sorts of situations. Sorry, I've talked a long time there, so I'll take a breath, Nicky.
No, that's great, Tom. I really appreciate
Mm.
that, because as you were sitting talking about that, especially around meetings, I was thinking of family scenarios, when families go out for dinner. I was particularly thinking about Christmas Day. I don't know why that popped into my head. But you end up having family dinners and somebody always dominates the conversation. It's
Mm.
always loud. And I was reflecting on what you were saying and thinking, I wonder how comfortable people would be able to do that observational thing, and how many times. I'm sure you get asked this question all the time. Like, how many times do you do it? But then the other question of, what if they don't change?
Yeah. Well, what if you don't change is a great question, because if they don't, you don't have any control over whether they change or not. They don't owe you anything. And I think that's the other thing, is that somehow we go into these conversations so invested in an outcome that if we don't get the outcome we want, that somehow feels like a failure on us. Nobody owes you anything. And actually, if you've got somebody and you've continuously, made observations about, perhaps like domineering behavior or whatever, then at some point you might ask them to make a change, because that might be the boundary that you need to set there. But it probably comes later. And if they still don't change, well, the boundary you might have to set is not going to see that person on Christmas Day. And, that might be an impact, but that might be something there. And so, yeah, I always think let go of the outcome. And also, I don't think it's like you have to have that conversation 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. It could be infinite times, or it could be one. That's the outcome. You don't know.
Mm.
Stick to the inputs.
Yeah, that's
Mm,
interesting, because a lot of the time we're like, well, I'll do it once, if they haven't changed their behavior, well, then I'm gonna have to change them. And I
yeah.
find that fascinating, that we think we can change other people because we know we can't.
Yeah. And also, Nicky, is that, I've been guilty of this lots of times as well, where I've really built up a conversation
Mm.
and, maybe put it off, put it off, put it off. And then the issue is just getting worse and worse and worse. And I feel like I have to then have this huge conversation. And actually, no conversation has to be that big, because if you think about it incrementally, then you can just start to feed stuff in, and over time the conversation builds. And I think sometimes we leave things so long, we want to sort things out, when actually, if we just do little bits here and there, it life tends to be a lot easier, and you don't destroy trust by that big conversation where somebody feels attacked.
Yeah, the sit down, we need to talk conversation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Can I
because
give
as
you
soon
some
as,
feedback?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and you're far more likely to get an emotional reaction to that conversation anyway, because people will
Mm,
feel that they're under the spotlight, a bit triggered, and they go
exactly.
into fight, flight, or freeze. Yeah, fascinating.
Exactly.
So having little
Exactly.
conversations, because I can see how that would work at home as well. Having those little
Mm,
conversations, especially with young people. I have
mm.
a teenager in my life, and I like to practice these things on her.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially with young people, rather than feeling attacked, which I think a lot of the time they probably feel anyway.
Yeah.
Whether that's right or wrong is neither here or there. It's just things that
Yeah.
are going on when you're young. I certainly remember being in my teens, and it was not an easy time.
No.
And yeah, and just having little conversations rather than the big sit down, we need to have a chat about this. And I
Yeah.
also think you talked about psychological safety. I also think that
Mm.
psychological safety is something that we should be very aware of at home as well.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think when we go into organizations and we perhaps help them to have some of these conversations, we talk about that, we're not taught how to have these, we're not taught how to have a difficult conversation at school. We're often not taught how to do it in the workplace. And lots of us come from families where, where there wasn't a culture of talking about things, and things were buried. And yeah, going back to those adaptations point, not only do you have the genetics of perhaps people that don't like, that perhaps find it difficult to have a difficult conversation, you've also got the adaptations in the household that brings and what that household valued. And I think that is so important as well to recognize that, people really do not find difficult conversations easy. I mean, as you'd expect, but they are easy. They just have to be made easy, I think.
Yeah. And I think sometimes when you give something a framework and a structure, what it does is it allows that emotional brain that's saying, no, this is not easy. I'm building up in my head. This is going to be the worst conversation I've ever had. So I'm going to have it in my own brain between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. I'm very good at that, I have to tell you. Having those
Yeah.
challenging conversations in my head between 2 and 4 when nobody else is there. They're not even there, but I can answer on behalf of them. When we have a framework, it kind of makes us stop, doesn't it, and go, let me think about this. Let me
Yeah.
think how to phrase it. And as soon as we do that, logic starts to take over and everything starts
Yeah.
to settle down anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a big mistake that we make is we stay in conversations too long. So, probably have some natural people pleasing tendencies, I'd say I have quite an anxious attachment style. And so I find it difficult to walk away from a conversation if I think someone's upset with me. Now, if in a leadership role you're giving somebody some bad news, like for example, maybe they've lost their job, maybe you're making them redundant, then I think a lot of the leaders that I observe, they give them the news, but then they try to make it all right and they sit in the conversation and just keep going, trying to make it all right. Well, in that situation, there's nothing that you can do to make that all right. That's just something bad that's happened. And so all you can do in that situation is ask what somebody's feeling like, get them to talk a little bit if you can, but let them know that you're there and let them know that you're there to support them. But actually, that might be the end of the conversation and they just need to go away, process it and think about it. And yeah, I think a lot of, criticism about how redundancy programs and things like that are handled is actually the result of people, with the opposite intention, trying to make it really good for people and really nice for people when actually there is no way of making that nice other than to say, I support you and let me know if you need anything, but you need to go in and process.
That's really interesting. I hadn't actually thought about it as you're staying in the conversation too long. Yeah,
Yeah, I
and
think it's
close.
very common.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people do, as you said, find it difficult to walk away. There's,
Mm,
what would you suggest, Tom, that how do you close a conversation? If it's when people say to you, can I have 2 minutes of your time, please? And it's going
mm,
to be half an hour and you've got a
mm.
ton of things that you need to do. So setting boundaries and saying no. How would you advise somebody to close that conversation?
Well, I mean, I'd always contract a conversation. So, if and this goes back to intentionality versus mindlessness, that if you contract your conversation, so and this just take practice and discipline. I think that if somebody comes over and says, have you got 2 minutes, and you've got 2 minutes, then the conversation has to start from, I've got 2 minutes. Is it going to be 2 minutes or do we need to have some more time? But I think there are just some really, I think it's just really important that set out your contract and then stick to those boundaries.
Mm.
I mean, I think closing a difficult conversation means that you might have to fight against some of your, strongest, you know, sort of strongest preferences or urges, if you like. So, if you've got someone, I mean, countless times in my career, I've had to give people bad news and I've had someone who's sitting in tears and all I want to do is just, hold them until they stop, crying and feel better. But I can't do that. And the only way to stop that conversation is to recognize that I'm in a state where my behavior, albeit albeit it's, it's intentionally good, is not going to help the situation. So I almost have to do the opposite of what my body is, my brain is telling me to do. And I think that often happens more broadly when we are triggered in any situation. So, if I tell a story quite a lot when I speak at leader programs and events where, because I know I'm quite sensitive, I can get an email that I find, say, a little bit critical from a client or, from a colleague. And my first response is like, oh, I've got to defend myself and I've got to say why they're wrong. Now, I know that. So I know I have to step away at that point and do the opposite of what my brain is telling me, which is my brain saying, write the email. I have to get the right part of my brain saying, no, we file that for now, and then we'll come back to it. I think the problem is that 3 hours later, I can come back to something and I can think, yeah, I'm perfectly calm now and I'll write the email and it'll be fine. But actually my brain's tricked me, because 3 hours later, I'll look at the email again and think, oh no, why have I written that? I was obviously, triggered. So I always talk about, whatever your natural trigger responses are, and, you can do lots of psychometrics to get a good idea of these, is often the best thing that you can do is just the absolute opposite. So if it says fight, if your brain says fight, hang back. If your brain says retreat, maybe go forward. And yeah, it seems to serve people quite well to try and just think about it on that basis, but not always easy.
Because as you said before at the beginning about intention, consciousness, that takes quite a conscious effort to recognize how you are reacting in a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're working with if I'm working with a group of senior leaders and we do some sort of psychometric where we understand strengths, triggers, and all that sort of stuff, that is the first part. That self-awareness is really important. But the next bit has to be like recognizing when you're in that state and recognizing when you're in that triggered condition. And it's not easy. We are essentially, I think, we are essentially apes, and we have very strong, mammal instincts about how we should react, and a lot of it's subconscious, and we don't really know what's going on. So yeah, not always easy, but can be done if you can be a bit more intentional about how you want people to experience you.
One of my favorite books just popped into my head as you were talking about that. Those primal instincts that we all have, and becoming far more conscious about them, is the Chimp Paradox, which is one of my
Steve Peters classic. Absolutely classic.
I always feel that he describes it in a really easy way to understand, and one of those books you can go back to time and time again. And
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm doing. Oh yeah, I get that again. So
the chimp, was it the chimp, the human, and the computer, isn't it?
That's it.
The
computer.
Really easy to remember. It's good.
Yeah. And I noticed you have a book on your shelf there called People. Tell me a little bit more about this book.
Yeah, so I wrote People a couple of years ago. So when I was first a chief people officer, I didn't really have a clue what I was doing, and there was nothing really out there to help. And I mean, one of the things that I work with a lot with C-suites is this idea of how lonely the C-suite can be, and how often on the C-suite you feel like you've got to have all the answers. You can't ask for help. You can't ask for support. And so I wanted to, I suppose, get some of my thinking around the chief people officer role, having been out of it for a couple of years, and having had a chance to reflect on what I'd done well and what I could do differently. So I also wanted to develop a framework. So I developed a framework called the CHRO Impact Framework, which looks at some of the core skills and some of the core personas, if you like, that you need to have the role. So skills in what you do, personas in who you are. And so I wrote that a couple of years ago. It's not a traditional business book because it's a story. It's about chief people officer called Joanna who's struggling in the role and goes to a coach and works through the framework. So there was a lot of me and her, a lot of the other people that I work with, and I coach and mentor. But it's been surprisingly successful. I would say, like, when I first started writing it, I didn't really want anybody to read it. I just wanted something to say, to give to people, and a framework. But the publisher said, no, you've got to put a bit of effort in if you want us to publish it. I mean, I did have to pay them to publish it, obviously. But so I made bit of an effort with it and ended up with something that I'm quite proud of. And it has actually been shortlisted for the Business Book Awards this year, which I was absolutely flabbergasted
Yeah,
about.
amazing.
So yeah, so I'll find out in September whether it's got anywhere in its category. So yeah, I'm proud of it. I'm proud of it. And I'm just writing the second book, which is almost a sequel. If it's almost a sequel to it, which is very much about some of the things that we've talked about today, about how chief people officers can support their C-suite to be more effective, to have better conversations, better relationships, and more psychological safety.
Hmm. And I know you specialize in helping people in C-suites, but listening to you, I actually feel that your strategies would be useful for all over the place. I do a lot of work with head teachers in GP
Yeah.
surgeries, with businesses.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can see how. So go and read the book, People, even if you don't work in a C-suite, because it sounds.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you can do links in show notes and things like that, but
Of course you
if people go to my website, they can order a free book there. I've got a garage full of them, so I send them out to anybody who wants them. That's a nice, cheap marketing tool for me. It's So anybody who wants one, go to my website.
That sounds like an ideal time for you to tell us about your website.
Yeah, so my website, well, HEX's website is www.hex-development.com. It's got everything about us and what we do, and there's loads of free resources on there. The OI 3C framework resources on there if people want to go and have a look for that. All our podcast episodes are on there. And you can order a free book there. And then I also post quite a lot on LinkedIn. So, do quite a lot of blogs and things like that, trying to get my thought leadership out into the world. And I try my best. Doesn't always work, but I do try and do that in as honest and vulnerable way as I possibly can, because I do think, I think vulnerability is a bit of a, it's been like a corporate buzzword for quite a long time, and I think people have got a bit muddled up between real vulnerability and, this sort of performative vulnerability. Like, I can honestly say that my vulnerability is very, very rarely performative. Like, I do really push myself to put myself out there, because I think, if you want to make positive change in the world, you have to make some noise, and sometimes that noise is going to be uncomfortable. So I hope people read stuff that I post and take something from it. And I'm always happy to hear from people. Just get me on LinkedIn.
Lovely. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for sharing those bits of your strategy, for talking about that joy, confidence and fulfillment. I think I know sometimes putting yourself out there can be a little bit scary, but it's definitely the ripple effect, doesn't it? It's the ripple effect that slowly but surely helps to change people's lives. So lovely. Thank you so much for being here. And at the end of this podcast, there will be a transcript note, and we'll put all your details in there.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I've had a really lovely conversation. So thank you for that.
Lovely. Thank you, Tom.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. I hope you found it useful. There is a list of helplines that you can use at the end of the transcript. Please reach out to somebody if you need to talk about anything that has affected you today. Please like, share, and subscribe. We're trying to make a big difference in the world, and we'd really appreciate your help. Thank you for listening. Take care.